The vast open plains of my family ranch stretched out before me as the morning sun cast long shadows across the fields my grandfather first tilled decades ago. 3 generations of hard work built this place, teaching me responsibility and self-reliance in equal measure. Out here, 30 miles from the nearest police station, my rifle was not just a tool but a necessity, for predators threatening livestock, for security in isolation, for putting food on the table. I walked the fence line that morning, checking for breaks where coyotes might slip through to the cattle pasture. My Remington rested comfortably against my shoulder, a tool passed down from my father. Just yesterday, I had used it to scare off a mountain lion stalking too close to the horse barn. That was ranch life. Practical problems required practical solutions. The construction had started 6 months earlier. The eastern 100 acres that once belonged to Old Man Wilson sold to developers after his passing. I did not think much about it initially. New neighbors meant new faces at the general store, perhaps some community growth. What I did not anticipate was how quickly those luxury homes would multiply, sprouting like invasive weeds across the formerly open rangeland. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. Official letterhead, certified mail. Notice of community formation, it read. Apparently, my ranch had been incorporated into the Platinum Ridge Estates Community Association without my knowledge or consent. A mandatory meeting was scheduled for the following week to introduce governance structure and community standards. I arrived at the meeting in my work clothes, straight from mending fences. The community center was newly built, all glass and polished stone that seemed to mock the weathered wood and practical design of the old ranch houses. Other longtime residents nodded at me with the same confused expressions I probably wore. That was when she entered. Patricia Wilcox moved like she owned the room, designer handbag clutched tight, lips pursed as she surveyed what she clearly considered to be beneath her standards. Her gaze lingered disapprovingly on my mud-spotted boots before she took position at the podium. "Welcome to the first official meeting of Platinum Ridge Estates," she announced, voice carrying the polished tone of someone used to being obeyed. "As many of you know, I served as city council member in Denver before relocating here. I understand how proper community governance creates value and safety." The election that followed seemed rehearsed. Patricia was nominated immediately, seconded by people I had never seen before, all new residents from the luxury development section. Her hand-picked board members were voted in with similar efficiency, while longtime residents exchanged concerned glances. "I have experience with transitioning mixed-use areas into proper residential communities," Patricia explained afterward, not quite meeting my eyes. "Change can be difficult for some to accept, but necessary for progress." Despite the tension crackling between us, I remained cordial. My grandfather taught me to measure twice before cutting once, in fences and in judgment. Perhaps this was merely the awkward beginning of necessary change. The area was growing after all. "I hope the association takes into account the different needs of working ranches versus residential properties," I said, extending my hand. "Some regulations that make sense in housing developments could be problematic for agricultural operations." Patricia shook my hand with the briefest touch possible. "The rules will apply to everyone equally. That is what makes a community function properly." Her smile never reached her eyes. 3 days later, another certified letter arrived. This one contained the new community bylaws, 47 pages of regulations covering everything from acceptable paint colors to landscaping requirements to noise restrictions that would make normal farm operations impossible. My blood ran cold as I turned to Section 4, Paragraph 7, my eyes fixed on words that threatened my entire way of life. No firearms permitted on any property within community boundaries. The letter slipped from my fingers, landing on the kitchen table my grandfather had built by hand. That civility I had extended at the meeting evaporated instantly. This was no ordinary homeowners association. This was a direct attack on ranch life itself. The community center buzzed with tension as I approached the microphone 1 week later. Documents in hand, I explained how ranching necessities differ from suburban realities: predator control, livestock protection, the simple fact that police response time exceeds 40 minutes out here. Several other ranchers nodded in agreement from their seats. The prohibition on firearms directly threatens our livelihood and safety, I stated, keeping my voice steady despite the anger bubbling beneath. I am requesting a formal exemption for working agricultural properties based on practical necessity and pre-existing use. Patricia barely looked up from her notepad, dismissing each point with practiced indifference. Her red pen made sharp marks as if tallying infractions rather than listening to legitimate concerns. "The rules apply to everyone equally," she stated coldly after I finished speaking. "Platinum Ridge Estates is transitioning to a premium residential community. Modern communities have no place for firearms, regardless of past practices." "This is not about community standards," Russell Jenkins, another rancher, called out from his seat. "This is about basic property rights and practical necessities." Patricia's expression hardened. "The bylaws were legally adopted and are binding on all properties within community boundaries. If you cannot adapt to civilized standards, perhaps rural living is not for you anymore." Something in her eyes revealed something deeper than mere rule enforcement. Not community safety concerns, but personal vendetta against our way of life. The weekly property compliance inspections began 3 days later. I watched from my porch as Patricia's luxury SUV crawled past my fence line, stopping periodically while she photographed alleged violations with a telescopic lens camera. The other board members accompanied her occasionally, but Patricia never missed an inspection of my property. The fines accumulated rapidly, arriving by certified mail every few days. Improper storage shed placement, $250. Unauthorized vehicle parking on my own property, $300. Excessive livestock noise during restricted hours, $500. According to the citations, my chickens were violating noise ordinances by clucking before 8:00 a.m. When I visited the general store, neighbors would lower their voices and express support out of Patricia's earshot. "This is getting out of hand," whispered Margaret Wilson, whose family had farmed nearby for generations. "But we cannot afford to fight. Our mortgage is with Platinum Ridge Financial, which is somehow connected to the development company. We are afraid they will call in the loan if we make trouble." Other ranchers and homeowners shared similar fears. Financial pressure or property entanglements kept them silent during meetings, their mortgages and financial situations holding them hostage to compliance. The community was fracturing between established residents and newcomers who embraced Patricia's vision of premium living. The situation escalated when Patricia distributed notice that HOA Security would conduct internal property inspections for firearms compliance. The notice claimed authority to enter homes and outbuildings with 24-hour notice to ensure no weapons were present on any community property. That evening, I contacted James Weston, a property rights attorney whose family had roots in ranching communities. His office was 2 counties over, but his reputation for defending agricultural interests made the drive worthwhile. James listened intently as I laid out the situation, spreading the HOA documents across his desk. His expression grew increasingly troubled as he reviewed the bylaws, inspection notices, and escalating fines. "This is not just overreach. It is potentially illegal," he said finally, removing his reading glasses. HOAs cannot retroactively restrict legal, pre-existing property uses, especially those protected under state agricultural provisions, and these inspection demands violate basic constitutional protections. A weight lifted momentarily from my shoulders, but it crashed back down the next morning when another certified letter arrived. This one was different, printed on legal letterhead with bold red text across the top. "Final violation notice. Enforcement action pending." The letter threatened property liens and forced compliance within 14 days, specifically mentioning removal of all firearms and compliance with all community standards. It concluded with a statement that chilled me to the bone. Failure to comply will result in enforcement proceedings, including potential foreclosure action. They were not just harassing me anymore. They were coming for my land. Legal papers and case files covered my dining table as days blurred into nights. Every spare minute not spent tending to essential ranch operations went to research. James had provided starting points, but understanding the full scope required diving deep into property rights law myself. State law clearly protected established agricultural uses, exempting them from certain restrictions that might apply to residential developments. More importantly, I uncovered Simmons v. Lakewood Estates, a case establishing that HOAs cannot retroactively restrict pre-existing property uses on annexed land. The ruling specifically mentioned that community covenants created after established use patterns cannot eliminate grandfathered rights without due process and just compensation. I created a detailed map of every property in the newly formed community, color coding by type, original ranches and farms in red, new development properties in blue. Then I overlaid every violation notice and fine issued in the 3 months since the HOA formation. The pattern became unmistakably clear as I mapped enforcement actions. Every fine, every violation notice targeted original ranching properties, while the new luxury homes received exceptions and variances with minimal scrutiny. The Johnsons had been fined for their tractor visible from the road, while 3 houses in the new section had boats and RVs parked in driveways without consequence. The Wilsons received citations for their windmill water pump being aesthetically inconsistent with community standards. Yet modern wind sculptures adorned several new properties without issue. This was not random enforcement. This was systematic targeting. I needed allies. Operating alone against a well-funded HOA board would be nearly impossible. One Tuesday evening, I placed calls to several other affected property owners, suggesting a meeting at the old diner just outside community boundaries, neutral territory where we could speak freely. 12 residents showed up, more than I expected given the climate of fear. Around plates of meatloaf and coffee cups, they shared similar experiences, targeted harassment designed to pressure land sales or compliance with impossible standards. "They cited me for having chickens," said Alina Miller, an 80-year-old widow whose small farm had been in her family for generations. "My property was a working farm decades before there was even a paved road out here." The most telling accounts came from residents who had already sold portions of their land. Each described increasing fines and harassment until selling became the only financially viable option. In every case, the properties were purchased by subsidiary companies with names like Platinum Ridge Acquisitions or PR Development Partnerships. The revelation that changed everything came from Walter Jenkins, former county clerk who had retired 2 years earlier. He recognized Patricia's signature on developer planning documents dating back 3 years before the HOA was formed. She was their consultant before becoming HOA president, he explained, sliding photographs across the table showing her with development company executives at county planning meetings. These documents show a 5-phase development plan. The sections where all your properties sit are marked as Phase 3 acquisition targets on plans filed with the county. We stared at the documents in stunned silence. This was not just HOA overreach. It was a deliberate conspiracy to use regulations to force land sales. Armed with evidence and legal precedent, I submitted formal contest of authority documentation to the HOA board, specifically citing state agricultural protection statutes and demanding immediate cessation of all enforcement actions against pre-existing property uses. I refused further compliance with illegitimate restrictions. The following week, I attended the monthly HOA meeting, this time accompanied by several other original property owners. Patricia seemed momentarily startled by our unified presence but quickly regained her composure. When the meeting reached open forum for community concerns, I stood and approached the microphone. The room fell silent as I placed the development plans on the projector. I would like to ask President Wilcox to explain her relationship with Platinum Ridge developers, I stated clearly. Specifically, why she failed to disclose receiving compensation from the same company that stands to benefit from property acquisitions resulting from her enforcement actions. Patricia's face flushed red. This is outrageous. I move to have this person removed from the meeting for disruptive behavior. Not happening, called a voice from the back, one of the new homeowners who had studied my evidence before the meeting. I want to hear the answer. The room erupted into chaos as Patricia demanded my removal, while others called for explanations. I stood my ground as the security guard looked uncertainly between me and Patricia. This stops now, I declared above the commotion, my voice carrying across the room. My family has owned this ranch for 70 years, and no paperwork you create gives you authority to destroy our way of life. We will not comply with illegal restrictions. We will not pay fraudulent fines, and we will not be bullied off our land. Patricia stormed out, but not before I saw something unexpected in her eyes, not just anger but fear. She knew we had discovered the truth. The weight of legal documents felt substantial in my hands as I filed them with the county courthouse. 97 pages representing my stand against tyranny disguised as community standards. Our lawsuit named the HOA, the board members individually, and Platinum Ridge developers as defendants. The complaint alleged illegal property use restrictions, selective enforcement, conflict of interest, and violation of grandfathered land rights. The filing fee alone cost nearly a month of ranch profits, but 16 other property owners had contributed to a legal fund, pooling resources for the fight ahead. This is solid work, James said as he reviewed the final documents. But be prepared. They have deep pockets and will not surrender easily. This could get much worse before it gets better. His warning proved prophetic. Patricia escalated immediately upon receiving the lawsuit notification. The very next day, her SUV parked outside my gate at 7 a.m., accompanied by 2 other vehicles bearing the HOA logo. What had been weekly inspections became daily harassment, with teams photographing every inch of my property from just outside the boundary lines. Violation notices arrived daily, each more absurd than the last. A fence post 2 inches above regulation height, $200. Unauthorized garden plantings visible from community roads, $350. Improper mailbox height, $150. Livestock-related odors affecting community enjoyment, $500. The community fractured visibly in response to the lawsuit. Some neighbors crossed the street to avoid conversation, afraid of being associated with the troublemakers. Others secretly delivered food and support under cover of darkness, leaving notes of encouragement in my mailbox. Stay strong. Many of us are with you, even if we cannot say so publicly, read one anonymous card. Financial pressure mounted quickly. The lawsuit required substantial retainer fees. While daily operation of the ranch demanded attention I could barely provide while fighting legal battles. Each hour spent with attorneys was an hour not spent on necessary work. My attorney requested comprehensive financial records during discovery, demanding access to HOA accounts, board meeting minutes, and communications between board members and developers. Their attorneys fought each request aggressively, but Judge Henderson, a no-nonsense woman with rural roots herself, repeatedly ruled in our favor. The plaintiffs have established sufficient cause to examine financial relationships between the parties, she stated during one contentious hearing. This court will not tolerate obstruction of legitimate discovery. The financial records, when finally produced, proved worth the fight. My kitchen table became an impromptu forensic accounting office as I traced irregular payments to consulting services, sharing an address with Patricia's private LLC. The payments predated the HOA formation, but continued monthly after she became president. Clear conflict of interest and potentially illegal self-dealing. Local news vans appeared after our first procedural hearing, where Judge Henderson denied the HOA motion to dismiss. Television cameras captured her ruling statement. This court finds substantial questions of authority and jurisdiction merit full examination. The motion to dismiss is denied. That evening, my phone rang constantly with calls from reporters seeking comments. I provided limited statements focusing on the facts. This case is about protecting established property rights against improper restrictions. The evidence will speak for itself. The media attention brought unexpected allies. 3 county commissioners requested meetings, concerned about potential improprieties in development approvals. The State Agricultural Board launched its own investigation into HOA actions against protected farming operations. The momentary victory celebration ended abruptly when Patricia's attorneys filed a countersuit demanding $1.2 million for deliberate community covenant violations, property value diminishment, and malicious defamation of the board's character. The astronomical figure was clearly designed to intimidate and pressure settlement. They want you to drop your case out of fear, James explained during our emergency meeting. This is a standard tactic. Make defending yourself so expensive and frightening that surrender seems reasonable. Their strategy became painfully clear. Bankrupt me into submission before truth could emerge in court. Each day brought new legal maneuvers designed to drain resources and morale. Motions, counter-motions, demands for hearings, procedural objections. The legal process itself became a weapon against those who could not afford endless litigation. I sold my prize bull to cover that month's legal fees, watching as the trailer carried away one of my finest breeding animals. The physical toll matched the financial strain. Nights spent reviewing documents rather than sleeping. Days divided between ranch work and legal meetings. Dark circles formed under my eyes as weeks stretched into months of constant battle. Their most aggressive move came during a preliminary hearing. Patricia's attorney, a sharp-dressed man from an expensive downtown firm, presented a motion for emergency injunctive relief. Your Honor, the plaintiff's continued firearm possession presents immediate danger to community safety and property values, he argued with practiced concern. We request the court order immediate compliance with weapons restrictions during litigation. Judge Henderson studied the motion carefully before looking up. Counsel, am I correct that your client seeks to enforce restrictions on property usage that predates HOA formation against an established agricultural operation protected by state statute? The community covenants clearly prohibit, he began. That was not my question, Judge Henderson interrupted. Motion denied. This court will not enforce disputed regulations while their very legality is under examination. As we left the courtroom, Patricia brushed past me with barely contained fury. You have no idea what you have started, she whispered. We will take everything you have before this is over. I watched her walk away, recognizing the threat for what it was. This was no longer about community standards or firearms or even property rights. This had become personal, a battle that would determine not just my future, but the future of every property owner in our community. Financial forensics became my second language as I traced money flowing between seemingly unrelated entities. With help from Walter Jenkins, who understood county record systems, and a forensic accountant who offered services pro bono after hearing about our case, I began mapping the complex web of companies surrounding Platinum Ridge. The patterns emerged slowly at first, then with unmistakable clarity. Patricia had received consultation fees totaling $347,000 over 3 years from shell companies, all connecting back to Platinum Ridge developers. The payments came through different corporate names: PR Community Planning, Ridge Acquisitions Consulting, Westside Management Services, but all linked to the same parent company through registration records. More disturbing was discovering this was not an isolated incident. The pattern repeated across 4 other communities within a 100-mile radius. HOA restrictions intensified on specific properties until owners sold at substantial losses, always purchased by subsidiary companies linking back to the same parent corporation. In each case, someone with connections to Platinum Ridge held key HOA board positions. They have been executing this playbook for years, James observed as we connected documentation across multiple communities. Target rural areas transitioning to development, establish restrictive HOAs, apply selective pressure on desirable properties, then acquire them at deflated prices when owners cannot sustain the financial burden of compliance or defense. The breakthrough came when I located Meredith Atkins, former resident who lost her family farm in a neighboring county through similar tactics 2 years earlier. She provided recordings of Patricia at a community meeting explicitly stating, "These restrictions will continue until you understand there is no future for agriculture here. Modern communities have no place for outdated land uses." Meredith's voice trembled as she shared her story. They fined us into bankruptcy. By the time we realized what was happening, we had no resources left to fight. We sold for 40 cents on the dollar just to escape the debt they created. Additional witnesses emerged with similar experiences. Elderly homeowners pressured into selling generational properties, small farmers driven out by impossible compliance requirements, all properties eventually acquired by Platinum Ridge subsidiaries and converted to luxury developments. Television cameras crowded courthouse steps as our case transformed from local property dispute to regional scandal, exposing systematic rural land acquisition tactics. The state attorney general's office requested copies of our evidence, opening preliminary investigations into potential fraud and racketeering activities. Meanwhile, Ranch operations suffered as my attention divided between legal battles and daily work. The constant stress and divided focus forced difficult decisions. I sold half my cattle herd, unable to properly maintain the full operation while fighting in court. The painful choice provided necessary funds for continued litigation, but cut deeply into future income potential. I walked fence lines at dawn before heading to legal meetings, repaired equipment late into the night after returning from depositions. Sleep became a luxury I could rarely afford, caught in 15-minute increments between urgent tasks. The physical and emotional toll mounted with each passing week. The financial pressure was calculated and effective. 3 of our original 16 plaintiffs settled quietly, unable to continue the fight despite the justice of our cause. Their properties were purchased within days by Platinum Ridge subsidiaries at prices well below market value. "They are picking us off one by one," Russell Jenkins said during one late-night strategy session around my kitchen table. "If we do not find something definitive soon, there will not be enough of us left to continue." The game-changing moment arrived unexpectedly on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. James called with urgency in his voice, requesting an immediate meeting at his office rather than discussing details by phone. I arrived to find a nervous young woman waiting in his conference room. Lisa Greenberg had served as Patricia's executive assistant at both the HOA and her private consulting company for 18 months before being terminated just weeks earlier. "I was fired for questioning certain practices," she explained, hands shaking slightly as she opened her laptop. "I have internal communications you need to see." The documents she provided were devastating. Emails and strategic plans explicitly documenting plans to regulate undesirable elements out of the community. More damning were spreadsheets tracking conversion targets with anticipated acquisition dates for each original ranch property. My property appeared highlighted as a strategic priority acquisition, with notations regarding its water rights and road access value. Most shocking was discovering my name on a list titled Primary Resistance Targets, with detailed notes about financial vulnerabilities, potential pressure points, and estimated resistance capitulation timeline of 6 to 8 months, exactly how long they expected me to last before financial pressure forced surrender. "They maintain 2 sets of records," Lisa explained. "The official HOA documents that appear legitimate, and these internal strategy documents detailing the actual plan. I was responsible for maintaining both." "Why are you showing us this now?" I asked. "Because what they are doing is wrong," she replied simply. "My grandparents lost their farm to similar tactics in another state. I did not realize what was happening here until I saw the pattern clearly." That night, with new evidence secured and properly documented, I sat on my porch watching the sun set over fields my family had worked for generations. For the first time since this battle began, I allowed myself to feel something beyond exhaustion and determination. Hope. The courtroom fell silent as Patricia took the stand on the 4th day of trial. Her professional demeanor remained firmly in place despite days of damaging testimony from former assistants, property owners, and financial experts. Her navy blue suit and pearl necklace projected confidence and authority, the image of respectable community leadership she had carefully cultivated. Judge Henderson studied her with measured skepticism while our attorney, James, organized documents at the plaintiff table. The gallery was packed with residents from multiple communities, reporters frantically taking notes, and curious legal observers drawn by the increasingly high-profile case. "Ms. Wilcox," James began after preliminary questions established her role and background, Could you explain these emails discussing strategic restriction enforcement to create market opportunities in targeted sectors? Patricia maintained her composure as the documents were displayed on courtroom screens. These were merely business discussions about community improvement. Any developing community must consider property values and future planning. Is that why this email specifically identifies my client's ranch as a priority acquisition target 3 months before you established firearms restrictions that directly impact ranching operations? Her composure cracked slightly. Those documents are being mischaracterized. We were simply identifying properties that might eventually transition from agricultural to residential use as the community evolved. James methodically presented meeting minutes where board members questioned selective enforcement patterns, along with Patricia's responses dismissing their concerns. Her voice rose defensively as explanations became increasingly contradictory. Judge Henderson leaned forward during cross-examination, removing his glasses when Patricia claimed ignorance of state agricultural exemption laws despite her legal background and real estate license. Ms. Wilcox, you testified earlier regarding your extensive experience in community development and transition planning, the judge noted. Yet you claim no knowledge of basic state statutes protecting established agricultural uses, despite serving as a paid consultant specializing in rural development transitions. I was focused on community standards, not agricultural exceptions, she replied, but her confident facade was visibly crumbling. The most damaging testimony came from community members themselves. Farmers, ranchers, and elderly residents provided emotional accounts of harassment campaigns, forcing property sales at fractions of market value. Martha Sullivan, an 83-year-old widow, described being fined $500 daily for her non-compliant garden until selling her family home of 50 years. The day after I signed the sales papers, all violations were suddenly forgiven for the new owner, a company I later learned was connected to Platinum Ridge. The whistleblower documents proved devastating. Internal communication explicitly stating goals to eliminate agricultural eyesores through strategic regulation and acquire specific properties within planned development phases. The spreadsheets tracking targeted properties, compliance pressure applications, and projected acquisition dates left little room for innocent explanation. Patricia's attorneys attempted to rebuild her credibility through character witnesses and technical arguments about HOA authority. Homeowners associations have broad discretion to establish and enforce community standards, her lead counsel argued. The plaintiffs voluntarily subjected themselves to these standards by remaining within community boundaries. Their arguments about private contractual authority collapsed when government property rights expert Dr. Elaine Winters testified that no private agreement can supersede established state law protecting agricultural use continuity. Her authoritative explanation of grandfathered rights and exemptions for pre-existing uses dismantled the legal foundation of Patricia's defense. In my 30 years researching property rights law, Dr. Winters concluded, I have rarely seen such clear evidence of deliberate misuse of HOA authority to circumvent established protections. This case represents textbook violation of state agricultural preservation statutes. The courtroom atmosphere shifted perceptibly as the evidence mounted. Even Patricia's supporters began exchanging troubled glances as the systematic nature of the scheme became impossible to deny. Legal observers who had initially viewed the case as routine property dispute now leaned forward, sensing precedent-setting potential. During final questioning, James presented Patricia with emails between her and Platinum Ridge executives discussing acquisition timeline acceleration and resistance management strategies for specific properties, including mine. These documents explicitly tie enforcement actions to acquisition goals, James stated. Could you explain how this represents legitimate community governance rather than targeted harassment designed to force property sales? Patricia's carefully constructed facade finally shattered completely. The community has standards. These backward, gun-toting farmers are preventing progress and property value appreciation that benefits everyone. Sometimes pressure is necessary for community advancement. The courtroom erupted at her admission. Judge Henderson pounded his gavel repeatedly before order restored. When silence finally returned, he issued his preliminary finding with unmistakable conviction. This court finds substantial evidence of coordinated efforts to utilize HOA mechanisms improperly as instruments of property acquisition, rather than community governance. The pattern presented is not one of legitimate rule enforcement, but of targeted pressure applied selectively to achieve property transfers at reduced valuations. As Patricia was escorted from the stand, her expression of stunned disbelief revealed the truth. She had never imagined being held accountable. The power she had wielded so confidently had blinded her to the possibility of justice prevailing against financial resources and influence. For the first time since this ordeal began, I allowed myself a moment of satisfaction. The truth was finally exposed in the light of legal scrutiny. Justice arrived in the form of a 68-page ruling systematically dismantling the HOA's authority structure. 5 weeks after final arguments, Judge Henderson delivered a comprehensive decision that left no aspect of the scheme unaddressed. The courtroom was standing room only as the judge summarized his findings. This court has rarely encountered such clear evidence of coordinated abuse of quasi-governmental authority for private financial gain, he began, his voice carrying throughout the silent chamber. Judge Henderson's decision established clear precedent. No homeowners association may retroactively restrict legal, pre-existing property usage rights, particularly those protected by state agricultural provisions. The ruling specifically cited the pattern of selective enforcement and targeting of properties identified for acquisition in internal documents. The financial settlement shocked everyone. $4 million total damages, requiring $50,000 payments to each property owner for intentional infliction of distress and interference with property enjoyment. The judgment further ordered dissolution of all illegitimate restrictions and refund of all fines collected under the invalid regulations. Most surprising to many observers was the personal liability assigned to Patricia and 4 board members for their roles in the conspiracy. The judge determined their actions constituted knowing and deliberate abuse of authority that exceeded HOA indemnification protections. Patricia alone faced $1.2 million in personal liability damages. The court finds clear and convincing evidence that defendants knowingly used HOA mechanisms not for legitimate community governance, but as instruments of targeted harassment designed to force property sales at devalued prices, the ruling stated. Such actions constitute fraud, abuse of process, and tortious interference with property rights. As the implications of the ruling spread throughout the community, reactions ranged from stunned silence to tearful relief. Homeowners who had lived under fear of enforcement now gathered openly, sharing stories previously whispered behind closed doors. The court mandated complete HOA restructuring, requiring supermajority approval for any future restrictions, and establishing permanent exemptions for original properties. An independent monitor would oversee HOA activities for 5 years, ensuring transparency and preventing retaliatory actions. Community healing began slowly in the aftermath. Neighbors previously afraid to speak now shared their experiences openly. Long-standing residents and newer homeowners found common ground in establishing reasonable standards that respected diverse property uses while maintaining basic community aesthetics. The ripple effects extended far beyond our community. The County Board of Supervisors established new regulations requiring disclosure of developer relationships with HOA management and prohibiting differential enforcement practices. State legislators began drafting bills to codify protections against similar schemes elsewhere. My dining room, once covered with legal documents, now hosted monthly meetings of the Rural Property Protection Association, where landowners from across the state learned to defend their rights. What began as my personal fight had evolved into a movement to protect rural property owners facing similar pressures throughout the region. Patricia's luxury home stood empty, a for sale sign swaying in the breeze. She had relocated to another state shortly after the ruling, but her legal troubles continued as federal investigators examined regional development practices for potential racketeering violations. 3 board members faced professional ethics investigations in their respective fields. The developers behind Platinum Ridge faced their own consequences. Class action lawsuits emerged in other communities where similar tactics had been employed. Their stock price plummeted as investors distanced themselves from the scandal, and regulatory agencies launched investigations into their development practices nationwide. More meaningful than the financial settlement was the restoration of community. The divisiveness Patricia had cultivated dissolved gradually as neighbors reconnected. Former antagonists found common ground in rebuilding governance based on mutual respect rather than control and conformity. The new HOA structure, developed collaboratively with input from all property types, established reasonable standards that accommodated agricultural operations while maintaining community aesthetics. Firearms restrictions were replaced with safety guidelines that acknowledged both responsible ownership rights and legitimate community concerns. 6 months after the ruling, I stood on my porch watching the sunset across fields my grandfather once worked. The fence lines remained straight, the cattle grazed peacefully, and my rifle rested properly stored inside according to the reasonable safety standards we collectively established. More importantly, I watched neighbors walking together along the rural roads, old-timers and newcomers alike exchanging friendly greetings. Children from the new development visited the ranch to learn about agriculture and responsible gun safety. The artificial divisions had given way to genuine community bonds. The HOA still existed, but transformed into what such organizations should be, facilitators of community cooperation rather than instruments of control. The new board included representatives from both original properties and new development, ensuring balanced perspective in all decisions. I finally felt peace knowing that not just my land but our entire way of life gained protection that would benefit generations to come. Sometimes justice requires standing firm against seemingly overwhelming opposition. The $50,000 payments to each homeowner represented not just compensation for harassment endured, but acknowledgement that rights must be defended, sometimes at great personal cost, to remain secure. As twilight deepened into night, I sent a silent thank you to my grandfather for teaching me the value of principled persistence. His weathered voice seemed to echo across the years. Land is more than dirt and grass. It is history and future bound together by those willing to stand their ground.